Luke chapter 8. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman who was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Who touched me? Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. But Jesus said, Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, he said. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, Don't be afraid. Just believe and she will be healed. When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except for Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and moaning for her. Stop wailing, Jesus said. She is not dead, but asleep. They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, My child, get up. Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. These are the words of the Lord.
As we shared with our children, our focus today is on some people who are in some desperate situations, and they discover that not only can they reach out, but also that Jesus reaches out to them and brings healing and restoration to them. Indeed, they are desperately seeking Jesus. Chapter 8 is all about this. It begins with the disciples. Jesus, you remember if you were with us last Sunday, we talked about how Jesus was at the lake of Gennesaret, and he is in the area of Galilee. That is the Jewish half of that lake on the western side. On the eastern side is a very Greek and Roman part of the world, actually called the Decapolis, which means 10 cities. And that was a part of the world that was actually free, sort of free from the Roman Empire. It was still participating in Greek culture across the lake. And Jesus was going there to supposedly for a respite, which reminds us that if even Jesus had to take some breaks, we also probably need to take some breaks in our lives. But Jesus was taking a break, and so he went there in a boat with his disciples. And as they were on their way, here's what happens. It says, and a windstorm came up on the lake, and they were filling with water, and they were in danger. And they went and woke Jesus, who was asleep in the back of the boat, and said, Master, Master, we are perishing, or we're dying. And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and then there was calm. And he said to them, Where is your faith? And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, Who then is this who commands the winds and the water, and they obey him? Their faith was kind of lacking. We're going to run into people the rest of this chapter who are not lacking in faith, but see very clearly that Jesus is exactly where they need to go for help. And they too, like the disciples, are going to reach out for Jesus, perhaps shake him and say, Lord, come to our help. Our message today helps us combat one of my least favorite phrases in the English language, which is this: all we can do now is pray. Think about that. Think about the impact. What does that phrase mean? It means we've given up all hope and everything else, and the only thing we have left to do is to pray. And usually that phrase is not filled with faith or expectation or anticipation of a yes. Right? That phrase is filled with expectation of further depression. When I hear the phrase, well, all we can do now is pray, it pretty much means we have given up, and it is a hopeless situation. But I hope that you're also going to discover that when we are in hopeless situations, and we may even hopelessly say, well, all we can do now is pray, that even in those situations, God has an opportunity to come and to take over and to restore and to rebuild all the things that are broken. When we have nowhere left to turn, Jesus is the perfect place to turn. We turn now to what we read just a moment ago. It starts out, and it's interesting how this piece fits together when you read Luke chapter 8, is that we start out with Jairus. He's a synagogue leader, and by this time, the Jewish world has already drawn itself a line and divided over the person of Jesus. The religious establishment has decided at this point that Jesus is a problem that needs to be eliminated. And Jairus, as one of the synagogue rulers, is part of that team over here. The Jesus needs to go team. Who's probably excited to see him cross the lake and leave. Then there is those who were outcasts, who are on the we love Jesus, he is the answer to all of our problems team. And Jairus, when he gets into difficulty with the most beloved person in the world for him, he changes sides. And he comes to the we need Jesus side, and he leaves his synagogue ruling friends. It says this, Jesus returned, and a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. It says, then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came, and notice his posture. It says, he fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. Jairus, too, has nowhere else left to turn. Perhaps he had used whatever resources at his means to try to bring healing to his daughter and was unable to do so. And so he recognized that Jesus had been doing amazing things. Maybe he heard about how Jesus had power over a lake that was overcome with a storm and people who were about to die. Maybe he had already heard about some of the people we saw last week who were healed. Maybe he had already heard that at this point, Jesus had already raised his friend Lazarus. Perhaps he heard about the power of Jesus and knew that he needed that power for his own life. He needed Jesus' healing himself. So he was willing to rid himself of all the social structure he had in his life and to go out and to branch out to the other side, join the other team, and go to Jesus for help. And it's interesting, the title of our series is Walking with Jesus. And it says this in just a tiny little almost throwaway phrase. It says, as Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. So Jairus came and said, Jesus, would you come and help my daughter? And Jesus said, yes, and walked back to his home with him. Reminder to us that even before healing comes, even before God has answered our prayers, we need to be reminded that Jesus has promised to walk with us. Later today, in our prayers, we're going to pray for people we know to be in times of difficulty, putting them in times of physical need, much like Jairus' daughter. And part of our prayers is that they're going to be healed, but part of our prayers also mean that they recognize that they are not alone. That even before they are restored, that God is with them and that he cares about the things that are happening to them. We also get to see not only power in Jesus, but also his compassion. Over and over again, we read in the New Testament about how Jesus had compassion upon people. That he had other plans, and he changed his plans because of his compassion. We see here that Jesus is planning to make his way to Jairus' house in order to bring healing to his daughter. And then we also see, as this events unfold, that Jesus is stopped by somebody along the way. It's amazing how often it tells us that the crowds are pressing in upon Jesus to the point that he is almost crushed by them. Think of like a South American soccer game. Right? The crowds often almost trample each other because of the excitement and the number of people who are there, and they're excited to be near Jesus. And as he is crushed by the crowds, making his way to Jairus' house, something pretty incredible happens. Somebody touches him. Doesn't that seem odd? Let's take a look. It says this, as Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him, and a woman was there. And listen to her story. She had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. Now, essentially, Luke, remind you who writes this, he is a doctor. He understands physical problems. Most commentaries suggest this was probably a menstrual issue. She had something difficulty in her body, and for 12 years, she suffered from that. Last week we talked about some people like the leper, who would have been excluded from joining together with God's people in the assembly at the synagogue or at church because of his disease. This woman, too, would have been excluded from Jewish gatherings of people because she also would have been considered to be ritually unclean. Also would have been improper for her to touch Jesus for many reasons. Again, because she is ritually unclean, Jesus is holy, he shouldn't be touching unclean things. Second of all, even to this day in Middle Eastern culture, it is considered taboo for women to speak with men in public, and especially to touch them. That is extremely scandalous. And yet, in her desperation, because after 12 years she tries to do this, and we've also find out that not only has she been bleeding for 12 years, but if you flip over to the book of Mark, Mark actually gives us more explanation about her background, and it says that she is now broke because she has spent everything she has on doctors trying to be healed. Mark even tells us she has been abused by doctors. That awful things have happened to her, maybe, subject to whatever sort of witchcraft kind of ideas about what might solve her problem. Who knows what things she went to trying to be healed of her difficulties. Everything has been taken from her. And here Luke, as a doctor, has to admit that medicine, that science has failed this woman. And yet, she reaches out, and says she came up behind him, she's sneaky, and she touched just the edge of his cloak, which would be way down here. Are you wearing a traditional robe? If you've been to a traditional church and pastors wear long robes, right? She's reaching down to touch the bottom of his hem of his garment. In other translations, and if you read this in Greek, it actually mentions that she touches the tassels on his garment. We'll get to that in just a second, the importance of that. And it says, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Interesting. She must have been cognizant of the fact herself that something was different in her body, something was different in her life, the moment she just touched the tassels on Jesus' robe. Incredible. And immediately Jesus says, "Who touched me?" Think about that. Peter points out, what a ridiculous question that is. What do you mean, who touched you? All 4,000 of these people just touched you, Jesus. What are you talking about? He says, no, somebody touched me. And she recognizes that she has been caught. And so she came trembling and she fell at his feet, essentially where she had already been. This is on an ancient piece of pottery, by the way. This is a depiction of this event. And there she is down on the ground by where she touched his tassel. And it says this, in the presence of all the people, she came and told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. You may go in peace. I'm just thinking about some of the details here. I mentioned those tassels on Jesus' robe. First of all, why would he wear that? I don't know if you noticed, but that's really fallen out of fashion for men to wear tassels on robes these days. Maybe if you happen to work with somebody who is a very devout Jewish person, you will notice that even underneath their suit coat, their shirt tails will be stuck out, and they will have tassels on the back of their shirt coat. Here's why they do that. Because in Numbers chapter 15, I didn't write all this out, but you do have a reference there if you want to look these up. In Numbers chapter 15, God's people were instructed to wear tassels on their clothing, and very specifically, a combination of white and blue thread was to be used to tie these tassels. And they were the reminder to them not to stray from God's word. Sort of a anti-hip fashion statement to remind them that their job was not to look cool, their job was to be devout and focused upon God and His Word wherever it was they traveled, irregardless of whatever the current trends were. They were supposed to do that in order to distinguish themselves as God's people, but also to remind themselves to be faithful to Him. Other interesting things that come about with these tassels, when we look through the Old Testament and discover some of the origins of where Jesus came from. The prophet Zechariah tells us something pretty interesting. In chapter 8, he says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says. In those days, in the days when God comes to bless His people, He says, 10 people from all languages and nations will come and will take hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe, by the tassels on his robe, and say, 'Let us go with you, because we have heard that God is with you.'" Interesting that the details of this story show that Jesus has come in fulfillment of the expectations of all of history. He has come to fulfill the expectations of God's people. The synagogue ruler discovers it, and this woman, in the midst of her difficulty, also discovers that Jesus is the place that she needs to be. And when she fulfills this prophecy from Zechariah, she falls on the ground, she reaches out and grabs just one tassel from Jesus' robe. She is immediately healed. And she also immediately tells the story. We're reminded. Maybe you've been to our men's group. We talked about stories last week and sharing our stories with our children and with other people. That sharing our story of what God has done for us is powerful because it allows them to see that God can do similar things in their lives. And so she proclaims what God has done for her. And look at the response. Then Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." It's an amazing impact. Remember that Jairus seeks out Jesus. Why? Because he cares for his daughter. If you have children, you know how much your kids mean to you. I remember before I had kids, when Brittany got pregnant, I was overwhelmed with excitement. She was nervous because she was probably a lot smarter than me. She had changed a diaper before. She had experienced how difficult kids can be. I had no idea. I was just excited. And people told me, "You won't believe how amazing it is when you have a child." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm sure it's going to be great." And I was overwhelmed when I first saw my son. With more love than I had ever experienced in my life. Finally realized, when parents say, you never understand how much we love you until you have a kid. That's true. And you have that overwhelming love for them. And Jesus refers to this woman in the same way. He calls her his daughter. I want to point you, the last note we have here in this section is from 1 John chapter 3. And John says this, he says, "See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called the children of God." And he says, that is what we are. That's the kind of love God has for us. That's the kind of love Jesus shows for this unnamed woman. Remember, Jesus was busy on his way to do something important. Jairus' daughter was in great need, and Jesus took the time out to help this woman and also to point out to others not only what he could do for her, but what he could do for us as well. Our own Lynn Erickson shared with me some of the power she recognized in this passage as she was recently homebound and bedridden because of various ailments that had all come together at the same time. And she was reading through this, and she shared with me this amazing picture she keep having in her mind of us being pulled along by God's grace as we simply cling on to his robe and just clinging to him, that he would whisk us through life in his grace and his care for us. And in the midst of her own great ailments, she found incredible peace, knowing that God had this care for her and that she had only to reach out for his garment, and she too would experience that kind of amazing healing. The story continues on. Jesus doesn't forget where he's going. He indeed goes to the home of Jairus. And we discover here in our next session that says this, always late. You ever notice this? Jesus is late a lot in the Gospels. And I mean that only half-heartedly. But Jesus seems to show up when all hope is gone. there are numerous times people reach out to Jesus for help. Maybe you've done the same thing. Maybe you've prayed to Jesus, and it seems like he doesn't answer. He seems to take too long. His answer comes, as he does in this account. He shows up too late to help. Mary and Martha, two sisters who were dear friends of Jesus, cried out to Jesus, asked him to come and help their brother Lazarus, who was also on his deathbed. Jesus waited 3 days before he went to go see his friend Lazarus. And I won't tell you the end of the story, but he gets there late. Jesus, on his way to Jairus' house, as he gets caught up with this woman who was bleeding, Jesus also shows up late to Jairus' house. Too late, it seems, to help. Listen to this. While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." First of all, take a lesson in how not to deliver bad news. Right? Thank you, friend, for putting that so lightly. Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Imagine what went through Jairus' mind. Imagine what went through his heart. Maybe he had some of the same emotions we also have in our prayers. Jesus, what are you doing? This woman could have kept bleeding for another day and a half, and you could have come and healed my daughter, and then we could have taken care of the bleeding, which has been going on for 12 years anyway. Maybe we feel the same way. We pray to God and ask him for healing, and it doesn't come. And yet Jesus says this. It says, hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Do not be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed." Without knowing what comes, without being aware of Easter and other events that we're about to celebrate, these words from Jesus don't make any sense. Jairus has heard the most awful news possible. How could he possibly hold out hope? How could he possibly continue to believe in Jesus? How could he continue to believe in the hope that she would be healed? As they get to the house, Jesus says these famous words, "She is not dead, but asleep." And listen to the response of these wonderful, heartfelt people. They laughed at him. They laughed at Jesus when he showed up and said, "She is not dead, but she is asleep." They laughed at him knowing that in fact she was. But he says, but Jesus went into the room, he took her by the hand. Thank you, kids, for demonstrating for us. Took her by the hand, and he said to her, "My child, get up." Maybe you know the end of the story. She indeed got up. She was alive again. Incredible that Jesus, in fact, was not too late, but it seems was just in time to show us something even greater. That even in death, there is hope for us as God's people. Because Jesus would appear to be too late one more time. When he gave his life for us on the cross, it would seem like Jesus was too weak or unfocused, or his power was too late or something, because the Savior of the world ended up dying, which made no sense to the disciples. But you see, when Jesus dies for us, and when he rises again on Easter morning, he redefines death. Jesus wasn't saying he didn't understand that Jairus' daughter had died. He was saying that he had a different understanding of death, because he redefined what death was. Death was no longer an end, but instead it was a transition because of him from this life to everlasting life. So that he could say of us too, when we die, he could say of our loved ones, when they die, that they are only asleep because of his overwhelming power to wake them up again, to live with him forever, to whisk them back to life. Is Jesus too late for you? Absolutely not. There is always time when Jesus shows up. We're reminded of the incredible power of the touch of Jesus Christ. You know, in that account of Jesus and the woman bleeding, in 4 verses in a row, every single time the word touch shows up. Touch shows up 10 times in the book of Luke and 4 times in 4 verses right there. And then again later on in that chapter when he touches the girl, Jairus' daughter. We see how powerful that is. Maybe we're reminded of how powerful it is for us. When someone touches us in the midst of our pain and our difficulty, maybe it's an embrace, maybe it's a hug, and it seems to restore us. But the touch of Jesus is so much more powerful. Especially after Jesus rose again from the dead. We're reminded, our closing says this, to touch and to see. Jesus, when he rose again from the dead, it seemed unbelievable to his disciples that they would see their friend alive again. That Jesus, in fact, was just sleeping for 3 days in the grave because he woke up again. When they saw Jesus and they were startled, they were frightened, they thought that they saw a ghost. And I love these words. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do you have doubts in your minds?" He says, "Look at my hands and my feet, where the holes were from the nails that put him on the cross." And he says, "It is I myself," and I even underlined it for you. It says, "Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." When he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And their doubts were overcome when they were able to touch and to see Jesus again. To be restored by him. To be reminded that in our own difficulties, all we have to do is reach out for Jesus. And he is there for us. To heal us, to restore us, and to give us hope, even beyond the grave itself. We're about to receive this incredible meal in which Jesus invites us to taste and to see, to touch and to be blessed. That in our troubles we too have the ability to reach out and to touch a lot more than just the hem of his garment. I want to point out this morning, you'll notice we have all new communion ware here that is in our church's theme color. But it is a gift, not from people, but in memory of people. It is from different people when folks have passed, people have given our church a memorial fund, and we decided to use it to purchase these things, because when we receive communion, we're reminded that communion is an intense connection between us and God. As he touches us, we're also reminded that other people have also received communion throughout history. Right? Peter, James, and John, maybe some of the other loved ones that we now miss, they're with Jesus. And as we come to this meal, we're reminded. Jesus tells us it's a foretaste of what we're going to experience in heaven. It's a connection between our world and his. From us who are still anxiously waiting here, and those who are already rejoicing with him. So his feast is ready. Come to his feast.